I'll start. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Riots Club. Welcome all of our regulars and newcomers as well. Really excited for today, but before we go on to the main event, I will just go through a few things. In the chat, Marion has kindly put a few links to our Twitter OSF YouTube channel, and you can also visit our YouTube channel in the coming days, where we will post all of the videos from the conference that we had the other day. So please make sure that you take a look. If you do join late, don't worry, you can always pause, rewind and fast forward using the link to that you're in. So a few other things, as you can see, we've got lovely upcoming speakers, so please do check out those. One that is not mentioned here is a talk by Durham, and we'll put a link in the chat, which is looking at working with R Markdown, and that's at 12 o'clock tomorrow. I'll rush on to the main event because Stuart has to pop off at 1. So for those who don't know, Stuart Ritchie is a lecturer at the SGDP at King's College London. He's a key advocate for reproducible research and conducted with Chris French and Richard Wiseman the first replication attempt of Bem's infamous study. In his recent book Science Fiction, Stuart examines fraud, bias, error and hype in scientific research and the incentives that undermine research and scientific integrity. I really solidly recommend this book, I have to say. You can pay me later, Stuart, for that plug. More recently, Stuart has focused his energies on cross-examining scientific claims relevant to the coronavirus pandemic, and in pursuit of this, he's set up the myth-busting website. So, and I'll put a link in the chat for that as well. So we'll hear more about this and other things. So over to you, Stuart, and thank you again for your time today.
Thanks, Sam. That's a very kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I'm in the office. I've not been in the office for a year. I came in because it's really noisy at home. It's really weird. There's cobwebs everywhere, but it's very strange. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about the year in COVID psychology, basically, and some of the rather unfortunate things that have happened, well, we'll go through it. It's actually quite a nice point to have a year retrospective, not just because I'm back in the office for the first time, but because a few of the dates that I'm going to be talking about are actually March the 4th. March the 4th comes up a few times in the talk. So it's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about how psychologists communicated science to the public at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then going to talk about how they reviewed the previous research in psychology, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about new research in psychology relevant to COVID, and then and there's a few little asides as well as we go along. So let me take you back to February the 11th, 2020. I think most of us were still in the office at that point, although maybe some of us had started to consider that we might not be for much longer. At that point, the world's largest ever quarantine had been happening for 2.5 weeks. So in China, for 60 million people. The WHO declared a health emergency. It wasn't a pandemic for another month, but it was a health emergency. More people had already died by February the 11th, 2020 than in the entire SARS-1 outbreak, so the original SARS. So we had 1,107 deaths. And a week ago, on February 11th, 2020, the US had closed its borders to China. Several other countries had as well. And Italy had declared a state of emergency after finding a few cases of COVID in the north. And on that day, February 11th, the New York Times published this article on how fear distorts our thinking about the coronavirus. And the solution isn't to think more carefully, it's to trust the experts. So you shouldn't, and this is by a social psychologist. I've got the COVID death count in the top corner there, and that'll come up in subsequent slides. this essentially the idea here was that we shouldn't worry too much about this. We're really scared, and it's distorting our thinking, and it's making us irrational about the risks of the coronavirus. And we all just need to just take it a little bit easy and stop being so irrational. The New York Times, a couple of days later, published another article where a few psychologists were quoted saying, well, look at all these pictures of hospital wards that are full up in Wuhan. That's making us very scared of what's going to happen, and so we're going to misjudge the risk. And actually, our brains don't really work properly when it comes to risk. Sometime after that, on February 28th, Cass Sunstein, who is not a psychologist but is he's a law professor, but he's published a great deal on psychology, and he has visiting professorships in various places in psychology departments. And he wrote the book Nudge, which is a big behavioral science book. He said, if you're feeling anxious about this, you can just blame probability neglect. It's a cognitive process, it's a cognitive bias that makes you panic when there's no real reason to panic. Actually, we can all calm down about this. Now, by this point, nearly 3,000 people had died from coronavirus, and it was spreading all around the world. But yet we were told, in Bloomberg opinion by Cass Sunstein, a very well-respected figure, that if you're worried about this, your brain isn't working properly. There's something wrong with your brain if you're anxious about this. Exactly 1 year ago, on March the 4th, 2020. Lynn Bufka, who was a clinical psychologist and senior director for practice, research and policy at the APA, the American Psychological Association, so the publisher of all those journals that you publish in and all that, said that it was superstitious behavior to wear a mask, to wear a coronavirus a mask in the coronavirus pandemic. Again, your brain isn't really working right if you think that this stuff is helping you. You're just not thinking about it properly. You're not thinking it through. You're just being superstitious if you want to take some precautions about the virus. 3,198 deaths. A few days after that, March 12th, Gerd Gigerenzer, who again is like one of the most famous ever psychologists when it comes to people's heuristics and biases, wrote this article in Project Syndicate where he said, it's a bit like terrorism. We all panic far too much when actually it's just a small number of people that get killed. We need to improve our risk literacy and learn to live with uncertainty rather than allowing ourselves to be held captive, he says. And so generally that was, again, downplaying. That was a psychologist, a very, very well-regarded psychologist, downplaying the risk of the virus. And I, to some extent, blame Satan for this, and by which I mean, famously, we're all taught in undergrad about the Satanic Panic, right? You may remember being taught about this. I certainly do. That psychologists had worked out that people had been given false memories about being abused in a kind of satanic ritual when they were kids. And there was this huge panic in the 80s and 90s that all these satanic cults were taking children and abusing them and so on. There's never any evidence that it actually ever happened. And yet there was lots and lots of panic about it, lots of newspaper headlines like this one here, and many others. And psychologists were quick to say, people are overestimating these risks. There's actually nothing happening, but people are very prone to fear-driven, risk overcompensation, or whatever you want to call it. My kind of just purely speculative view is that this kind of thing makes psychologists, jump to the conclusion that whenever people are scared of something, it must be, an overreaction, and actually there's not much going on. There's not actually much tangible stuff there to drive it. So I sort of blame Satan for this. For all of these previous headlines, although not in the way that you might first assume. By March 26th, Cass Sunstein had done a complete U-turn. He actually said this time the numbers show we can't be too careful. We were up to over 20,000 deaths worldwide by that point. And he said, look, I've done a hard-headed cost-benefit analysis. Usually this would confirm that it's dangerous to be overcautious, but this time it's different. Now, he did not mention at all in that in that article. The previous article that he'd written just a couple of weeks earlier saying your brain is broken if you're worried about coronavirus, didn't mention it. Didn't even give a link to it or anything like that. It doesn't come up. But this time he's saying we've got to really lock down and so on. And by the way, later that year, in August, he was made the head of the World Health Organization Technical Advisory Group on behavior science for the pandemic. So I guess that's how the world works. I also just wanted to there's a sort of a parallel story happening in the British media regarding psychologists. And it was about behavioural fatigue. This was a massive debate that happened because the UK's Chief Science Advisor, Patrick Vallance, and also the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, said that lockdown shouldn't happen too early because of behavioural fatigue. Because there's this thing called behavioural fatigue. If you tell people to stay at home too early, they'll get fed up with this. They'll start to leave their homes and break the rules and so on, and it will cause the virus to spread even more. And this is clearly a psychology claim, right? This is clearly something you could go to psychologists and say, do you think this is correct? Do you think there's any evidence that this might happen? People did indeed do that, and the government's behaviour science, psychology advisors said there's no such thing as behavioural fatigue. This concept of fatigue was rejected. It's just not a concept that exists in behaviour science at all. It was unhelpful for the chief medical officer and the chief science advisor to use this concept. And so it looked like psychologists were kind of debunking bad information in the, with the government's advice. However, it turns out that actually, if you did actually read the literature, there's actually quite a lot of stuff on, not necessarily called behavioural fatigue, but there's quite a lot of stuff on people giving up on measures, or certainly lowering their compliance with measures as time goes on. So there's this great article by Von Bell, which I missed at the time. I was very much on the side of psychologists are showing that the advice is wrong. But Von Bell wrote this article showing that actually, there are quite a few papers that talk about behavioural fatigue. By no means do they all show that definitely people's, behaviour falls off a cliff after a certain time and they start to break all the rules. Not at all. It's a complex literature. But there was stuff there, and the government's behavioural science advisors had just completely, missed it or had misinterpreted it or something, and were unable to actually talk about the scientific basis of this, and just instead said there's no such thing. So basically, with these two stories, the kind of downplaying the risk and the behavioural fatigue thing, I'm sort of trying to give you the impression that psychologists, behaviour scientists, whatever you want to call them, maybe didn't have the clearest view on evidence, and maybe were a bit unsure about what they were talking about in terms of the actual evidence for people's behavioural responses to, epidemics and pandemics. Nevertheless, this article came out in I think April 2020, something like that, which is a review of all of the or lots of the social and behavioural science that supports the COVID-19 pandemic response. And there was a big deal made of this paper. It was lots of researchers, including, by the way, you might note there, I've underlined them, including Cass Sunstein, who we've previously met, who said that the pandemic was nothing to worry about, and then said it was. I mean, better to go that way than the other way, I suppose. But anyway, lots of big names here, and the idea here was that they reviewed the literature. By the way, they wrote this paper in 1 week. From idea to acceptance, this paper was completed in 29 days, written in 1 week, and then sent off to the journal and accepted within 29 days. So very, very quick. Not sure I would sort of show off about that if I had written a paper within a week and sent it off to a journal as quickly, but they wrote a blog post saying that was, that's what they did. Fair enough. I just checked the other day, and it has 1,185 citations. So a big deal for a paper that was published, in April last year, in 1 year. And they said urgent action is needed to mitigate the potentially devastating effects of COVID-19 and action that can be supported by the behavioural and social sciences. Okay. And they said in the sections that follow, we try to describe the quality of the evidence to facilitate careful, critical engagement by readers. So they're saying, look, we've got all this evidence in the literature previously, you know, pre-COVID, and we want to review it and just pick out the best stuff. But we want to be critical of it. We want to describe the quality of the evidence. And so, you know, in the paper, there are things like this, some insights for public health experts. A lot of it, I would say, I mean, there's no references here, but a lot of it, I would say, doesn't really even need references. A lot of it is stuff like, you know, social distancing as a term doesn't sound as good as physical distancing, because social distancing might make people feel like they're cutting off meaningful interactions and so on. That's thoughtful advice. That's probably might be helpful advice. No one took that advice. Everyone still calls it social distancing, but it's helpful advice. I'm not sure it's based on, you know, empirical science or anything, but that was in the paper. But they also had lots of sections that were based on empirical science. So they covered things like threat perception, leadership, stress and coping. I'm going to highlight healthy mindsets here because this is the final aspect of the paper, and I dug into this in some detail, and I'm just going to go through what I found. I just took it, you know, any section of the paper and looked at all the references to see what the quality of the evidence was, because unfortunately, if you read the paper, despite the fact that they said that they would, you know, look at the quality of the evidence and encourage critical engagement, there's no critical engagement as far as I could tell, or very little in the paper whatsoever. So here's all the data on healthy mindsets. It's every single reference that they give on this particular subsection of their article. So first of all, they reference a theoretical paper that says that adversity might produce healthy mindsets, and it says in that paper that, you know, here's the theory, but we haven't actually done the research yet. Then there's a review focusing on stress and mindset, mainly looking at academic outcomes, not necessarily health ones. A review paper from 1989 that mainly looks at studies in rats. A review from 1998 that makes similar points about stress might make you tougher. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, all that sort of stuff. A biochemistry paper on a particular steroid where, you know, they looked in rats and in vitro, but nothing, you know, in humans. A review sketch of this idea that you can grow psychologically after a trauma, and an N equals 133 study where they use this, you know, the social stress test where you have to do a talk in front of a panel and it stresses you out. So they did that. I wouldn't say the evidence in that paper looked extremely strong. And then an N equals 63 study, which used that same paradigm with what it described as marginally significant results, p equals 0.07. And so I would say that if you add all that up, it doesn't look like a particularly strong set of evidence to me. And if I was, you know, going to advise politicians on the development of healthy mindsets, I'm not sure I would feel very confident relying on this kind of stuff. And, you know, you might think, well, that's just one section of the paper, maybe the other sections are stronger. I think they vary. We looked at a couple of other sections as well in detail, and there's certainly stuff like this in every section. I haven't picked this because it's particularly bad, but you know, there are sections that are somewhat better. But I wouldn't say that I was super impressed by the quality of the data that's being brought to bear from the previous scientific literature on this, you know, behavioural question. And we all know, I mean, this is the Riot Club. We all know that we're having a replication crisis. There's this more recent paper by Tagliarconi, who, if I remember correctly, presented this at the Riot Club on the generalisability crisis. Everyone should go and take a look at that. So we're having these, you know, dual crises of research that we can't necessarily rely on, whether it will replicate when other people come along and try and do the same study again, and also research that's very limited in its contextual aspects to, you know, the lab that we're in, the particular type of circumstance that we're in, and it doesn't necessarily generalize out. I mean, there's also lots of statistical points made about the generalizability in that second paper as well that are important to take on board. So I joined a whole bunch of colleagues, they're all noted here, to write this article called "Use Caution When Applying Behavioural Science to Policy," and it's kind of our response to the previous review that I just talked about. We said, there's lots of reasons to worry about applying this behavioural science research to the current crisis that we're in. So first of all, a lot of it is done on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people living in those kind of countries. So it might not necessarily apply to other groups. Often the effects that we're estimating are not particularly precise and are kind of messy. We rarely test the generalisability from the lab to the real world or from one context to another. Self-reports are often used in place of the actual behaviours. So saying that you'll get a vaccine, for instance, instead of actually checking whether you have got one. It's still pretty rare in psychology research or behavioral science in general to do, for an independent researcher to do a replication of your research. And generally, studies, as they kind of have to, they oversimplify the messiness of the real world. But, we were saying that they oversimplify it to a pretty great extent. And, that's needs to be taken into account when you're saying to politicians or policymakers, whatever, this is what you should be doing on the basis of our research. And being broadly psychologists who wrote this paper, we all obviously have severe physics envy, and we thought we would steal an idea from physicists or engineers, I guess, at NASA to give a kind of a pointer for how one should think about applying research to a crisis situation or applying research in general. So this is NASA's technology readiness level scale, right? So this is what NASA use to see whether a piece of technology that they've developed is ready to be used in actual space flight context. So first of all, at the lowest levels, you've got technology that has you've observed the basic principles. You've kind of thought about what the applications might be. You've done some kind of experimental testing, proof of concept testing. You've tested the components and so on in a lab environment and then in a real environment. And as you go up the technology readiness level scale, you get to technologies that have actually been tested in real world situations. And once you're at the technology readiness level 9, you've actually sent people up into space, with this technology, and it's worked and it's actually successfully done whatever it is that you had planned for it to do. So, NASA can say, well, we can't use that one because it's only on technology readiness level 4, and we need to plan some testing, some experimental research on that particular piece of technology. So we were kind of inspired by this to adapt it to a psychology context or a social behavioral science context and talk about evidence readiness levels. Now, the specific levels and so on, we can debate and argue, and we can have a conversation in the Q&A. I would say I'm not wedded to any of these particular levels, but the idea is that at the lowest level, you've just thought about a problem. You've talked to people in the particular settings that are important, and discussed potential issues and so on with whatever you're looking at. You've looked at previous evidence. You've looked at, as you go up the scale, you're starting to look at the validity of the particular measures you're using, whether the measures work in different contexts. You're looking in observational settings. You're thinking of formal predictions that might be tested in a confirmatory style study. You're building up to causal inference. You're building up to testing in actual situations, from the lab and then into real situations, and then really actually using whatever finding you're talking about, whatever theory from social and behavioral science you're talking about in a crisis situation. And we argue in the paper that a lot of the evidence in the previous psychological literature and a lot of the evidence in that paper that I just showed you the review is at the lower ends of the evidence readiness level framework, right? It's not stuff that has been really rigorously tested. It's stuff that kind of comes out of one or two different experiments, has never really been tested in the real world. And you might think, well, hardly any psychology has been tested in the real world. And I think we would come back and say, well, that's the problem, right? That is the issue, is that we do a lot of lab research, and then we have these unknown issues of generalizability to other settings, other populations, other groups, and so on. So we thought this was a useful mental framework to have when you're thinking about, does the evidence I've got, does that actually warrant telling policymakers about it, or at least telling policymakers about it without saying we're a bit uncertain about this particular evidence. You could say to them, well, we have these findings, but we have low confidence in them. We think that they maybe don't apply across a range of different situations. We haven't necessarily tested the generalizability. We are a bit uncertain about this, and you can point to the evidence readiness level that the finding is at, and you can build your next study on that evidence readiness level. So you can say, look, we're at level 4. The next stage to make this realistic to apply in situations is we need to get up to level 5. And of course, you need to keep updating the evidence, even if you're at the top levels. There's not a kind of end to this. We don't want to be put out of a job, do we, psychologists? But obviously new situations arise where evidence needs to be updated all the time. And it's similar to you've probably all seen this, maybe even at previous Riot Club talks. You've seen the Open Science Evidence Pyramid for Controversial Research by Chris Chambers, and he talks about research that is not really even worth mentioning to policymakers, and then evidence as you go up and get more confirmatory research, more pre-registered research, more research that's open, and so on, and that's meta-analysed. That should be the stuff that we're communicating to policymakers. So that's kind of how we should think about the previous literature, I think, how we should look back at it. And I think people really haven't looked at the previous literature in that way. They've kind of been picking and choosing research that might be interesting, that might be relevant, but without really communicating where it is on this pyramid or where it is on the evidence readiness level framework when talking to politicians. I want to just then go to talk about new research that was done and the kind of the promise of behavioral science research at the start of the pandemic to what we actually got. There was this article in late February 2020, which said that behavioral science must be at the heart of the public health response to COVID-19. This is a really important thing to get behavioral science right. It's all very well to develop vaccines and so on, but we need to convince people to take them, and to do that, we need behavioral science. Later on in the pandemic, you had behavioral science can curb the cases of the coronavirus. Behavioral science can promote positive actions. You had all sorts of these articles kind of hyping up the idea that there's this set of people, behavioral scientists, they can tell you, if you're a politician or whatever it is, they can tell you what you should be doing to maximize the uptake of healthy behaviors in the pandemic. Compare that to what psychologists were busy doing during, in the research on the pandemic. A lot of them were developing new measures to measure COVID-related anxiety. So you had the COVID-19 perceived risk scale, the fear of COVID-19 scale, the COVID-19 anxiety syndrome scale, the coronavirus anxiety scale, the COVID-19 anxiety questionnaire, the COVID-19 burnout scale, the COVID-19 pandemic mental health questionnaire, the COVID-19 student stress questionnaire, and perhaps somewhat ironically, the obsession with COVID-19 scale. These are just a selection of different questionnaires that have been written to measure people's behavior. Each of these researchers got a paper out of this. They published a paper with some analysis of this scale that they'd given to a set of people online, and that's what psychologists were busy doing. Now, I'm sure developing new skills is very important. I just wonder if a couple of these might have been somewhat redundant. Certainly looking here is not the exciting behavior change stuff that we were told that we would get out of behavioral science. And it turns out that actually the number of proper, randomized controlled trials of behavioral interventions in COVID, so not just developing scales or things like that, but the actual number of proper trials has been extremely low during the pandemic. So even though we've had thousands of trials of different drugs, certainly thousands are registered and will eventually report, or you hope they would report, hundreds have been reported. Only 13, this is early last month was the last update to this website, but only 13 behavioral, environmental, social and systems interventions, as they call them, had been registered, and only 4 had been reported of actual trials of changing people's behavior. So, again, it seems like the kind of the hype about behavioral science didn't really translate into lots of new evidence on how to change people's behavior during this particular pandemic. And in fact, when so there was a preprint kind of registry website, it kind of stopped registering in September last year. There will be many more by now, but even just by September last year, there were almost 600 new preprints from psychology research on COVID, and we had reports of journals fast tracking reviews. Some journals actually shut off their fast tracking because they realized it was leading to kind of low quality research getting through. And in fact, this isn't just psychology, but in general, the median time from receipt of an article to acceptance for a COVID-related paper was 6 days in June, according to one analysis, which is astonishing when you think about how long it took you to publish your last paper. 6 days is really quite astonishing. The last I heard was that we've had 85 COVID papers retracted from the literature. Now, we don't know if that's more or less than we would expect for this, given that there's an awful lot of papers. Actually, there's not that many psychology ones in the list. But we'll keep an eye on that. But there certainly has been a lot of low quality research come out, and I think the scientific system has not really helped in the respect that it's been actually lowering its standards in the pandemic rather than increasing them. This article came out early in the pandemic, called "Against Pandemic Research Exceptionalism," and the arguments here were that we shouldn't just be saying, well, we've got a really urgent situation. It's a pandemic. We need to just lower the standards. Just let let as much research through as possible, even if it's unblinded studies, small sample size studies, research that's generally quite low quality. It's so important that we get the answers right now that we can lower those standards. And they're arguing in this article, which I do recommend everyone reads. They're arguing that, in fact, this is completely backwards. It's so important to get proper high quality evidence on the pandemic because we want to actually save people's lives. We don't want to be misled. And I think anyone who thinks that we can just drop our standards has not really understood the problems of the replication crisis, the generalisability crisis, all the issues that we've had and that have been talked about in extreme detail over the past 10 years or whatever in the psychological and scientific literature more generally. Has not really understood how bad this stuff is at distorting the evidence base, at distorting what we apparently know about, in this case, people's behavioural responses to the pandemic. So well worth a read there. And actually, you had a talk at Riot's Club like yesterday or the day before, from the lead author of this paper called Open Science Saves Lives. So I'm not even going to go into huge detail, but just to point out this paper, which said, actually, there are things that scientists can be doing to make their research more open and transparent that actually will help us get away from all these flawed studies, these studies that have been retracted in the pandemic, these duplications of research, wasting people's time and effort and resources. Not just developing endless scales that are basically the same thing, but research like trials as well, which for certain drugs people have done hundreds of trials of the same drug, very small trials all over the world, which are just going to cause confusion rather than definitively answering the question. And the argument in this article is that open science can kind of point us in the right direction by pre-registering analyses, making materials and data open, and certainly being a bit more transparent in who's peer reviewing articles. There's also been discussions about preprints and so on. Again, I point you towards the talk, which I'm sure is on YouTube, from the Riots Club from earlier this week. And I didn't want to be too negative, so I did want to point out that I am seeing behaviour science research that does apply many of these principles. So this paper came out just last month, just a few days ago, about encouraging people to accept the idea of getting a vaccine by showing them that other people in their community are going to take it, and having this norm for taking vaccines. That was the idea of the paper, but it was pre-registered, it was large sample, it was across many different countries, and so on. It still had the problem of that you're asking people to report their behavior, but it made that clear. It made it clear that what was being measured was intentions rather than actually measuring whether someone actually did go and get the vaccine. So I am seeing higher quality research appearing, and this would seem to be an example of that. It's on SciArchive right now. And I just wanted to make one final point, which is that there's a lot of research on misinformation about COVID, and Sam mentioned at the start that I've made with some colleagues. I made this website which debunks some of the COVID misinformation that's going around, but I found a bit of the debunking quite awkward because a lot of the time the misinformation that is now being spread by people who are, I would argue, irresponsibly spreading, incorrect facts about COVID, incorrect facts about its spread, incorrect information about its how deadly it is, incorrect information about which interventions will work to stop, slow down the rates of COVID. A lot of those same arguments were being made by mainstream sources earlier in the year. So if you go back to the time we were talking about, you go back to about a year ago, you actually start to find, the direct opposite of what we now think is the case, being spread by completely mainstream sources. So, you had the US Surgeon General in late February saying, seriously, people, stop buying masks. They're not effective. Our chief medical officer said, don't wear masks. We actually banned adverts in the UK for face masks 1 year ago today, March the 4th. And by the way, 1 year ago today is when Chris Whitty said, wash your hands, don't wear a mask. We actually banned adverts because they were misleading people and making people scared and so on. And the World Health Organization had this similar advice on its website then as well. So I guess I just wanted to throw in the point at the end that we're coming along as psychologists and saying we want to combat misinformation about viruses, and all that. But we need to be a bit careful because a lot of the misinformation was being spread by mainstream sources as well. So it's unclear, if you had been anti-mask on the 4th of March 2020 rather than the 4th of March 2021, you would be seen as promoting the standard view, whereas now you're promoting misinformation. So I just wanted to highlight that fact that I don't blame a lot of people for being confused about this due to the mainstream sources vehemently promoting stuff that they could not possibly have been that certain about. No uncertainty here. Just don't wear masks. Stop buying masks. Ban adverts of masks. So I think the problems with the way this has been handled has spread beyond. It's not just psychology. It's kind of a problem of expertise in general, I would say. And by the way, I'm fully pro wearing masks, but I always was right from the start. So to conclude, look, we all want to help, and psychology research, I think, has the potential to help if it's done well. The problem is that lowering our standards and just our standards both for doing new research and also for looking back at the previous stuff that's been published might not just be useless, but it might actually harm the coronavirus recovery. And in principle, as I say, this stuff is really important. In practice, it's a bit more difficult. And it's very hard to rise up the evidence readiness level ladder that we talked about. And, you know, if you say you're going to be critical about the previous literature, you actually have to be critical. You actually have to dig in and see what the readiness level of that research is, rather than just saying, well, look, there's a paper. You're a politician. I'm going to tell you about this paper that's been published. That's not good enough. And I would argue that being transparent, being open, doing all the open science stuff that, you know, people who attend this lecture series are interested in is more important than ever in the pandemic. And I think the pandemic has just reinforced that we have a lot of serious problems in the way that we do science. Nothing new has arisen, but I think it's just really highlighted all these problems. And we're not trying to sell things. We're not trying to say to people, take our science seriously. We must be part of this reaction to COVID. We must be part of the government's policies, because we're behaviour scientists and we have a thing to sell you. It's not about that. It's about saying, is there anything here that we can do? Is there anything here that we can discover in our previous literature? Are there studies that we can do right now to try and improve the situation? We're not salespeople. And I actually think that there is good psychology research that just barely anyone has really talked about that might be useful in this context. And one example of that, just to close out as just a kind of an interesting thought. One example is that people have been thinking about, Philip Tetlock and various other people have been thinking about rating forecasts, right? So working out who makes the best forecasts about future events, trying to understand what their characteristics are and what makes them so good at doing that, and just holding people to account for forecasts they've made, and you can stop listening to the people who have made bad forecasts and start listening to people who are making good forecasts, and try and learn their habits and make good forecasts. And just to go right back to the very start of the talk, where I was talking about psychologists who were essentially making really bad forecasts about what would happen. They were saying, you don't need to worry about this. You don't need to be too concerned about COVID. Your brain is not working correctly if you're concerned about this. They were essentially making very, very bad forecasts. So at the very least, if we start holding people to account, which is what I'm trying to do in this talk to some extent, we might have fewer really bad forecasts in future, and that'll be at least one benefit of at least one insight from psychological or behavioral science. So thank you very much for listening. Feel free to email if you want any of these slides or references and so on. And we've got some time for questions right now. Thanks very much.
Wonderful, Stuart. Very, very good talk. We've got loads of questions. The question Q&A board is busier than Andrex 12 months ago. We have a question from Lisa Debreen, actually. She asks, to what extent should psychology researchers do both basic empirical research and application, or should these roles be more specialized?
Good question. I think a lot of the problems come from when basic research is, like in some of those mindset things that I mentioned in the talk. A lot of the reviews there were on basic research and rats and in vitro studies and so on. A lot of that is then taken to just automatically somehow apply to applied situations. And I think that's it's a similar sort of problem. It's analogous to the problem where you do an exploratory study and then you write it up as if it was a confirmatory study. Like that line between basic and applied, and the line between exploratory and confirmatory is often blurred when people talk about it, because, as I said there, people want to help. People want to say, well, my research on mice, my research on rats is instantly applicable right now. You see it in loads of different fields, dietary stuff, whatever. You see it all the time. I think, so I think the big problem is when people are essentially hyping their research beyond where the data can go, and that should be discouraged at every opportunity. By the way, Lisa is one of the co-authors of the evidence readiness level,
and a very instrumental figure as well in the open science movement. So do check out.
I've been using your R package to generate simulate correlations recently, Lisa, and it's been really great.
Wonderful. So thank you for that contribution, Lisa, and it's good to see you again. We've had a flurry of questions come in. I'll just pick up one question that's germane to what you've just finished off on, Stuart, which is, sure, what do you think about the COVIDization of research. I'm mindful of a recent tweet about how masks could hamper language development in children. I mean, any thoughts on this sort of just bolting on COVID at the end of grants and so on?
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to this thing, like we all want to feel like our research is relevant and that we can help, and that our research is, and if you think about it long enough, basically any research can be applied to COVID. But there was an article, it was a kind of an open letter thing by some medical journal editors and various researchers saying, can you please stop doing this? Can you please stop just publishing any old thing on COVID? We want people who are actually going to produce something relevant and something, you know, high quality and add it to the debate. Of course, the problem with saying that is everybody thinks that what they're doing is relevant and high quality and so on. And you can't proscribe certain types of research because that goes against academic freedom. So I find this quite a tricky problem of like trying to get around the issue that people think their research is really good, and yet we all know that it can't all be that good. So I think part of it is getting the messages across about how research can be improved, and that's what, you know, we're trying to do in these kind of talks, and in the kind of open science movement, and to get people to be a bit more critical, not just of other people's research, but of their own.
Good. Okay, so let's quickly move on to the next one. So the next one, so just to remind everybody, if you can, just upvote questions that are already in to avoid duplication, and then I'll prioritize the ones with the most votes. So the one with the most votes at the minute is oftentimes decision makers have to do one thing or another, but either way they have to make a decision. Would you say it's better to base decisions on weak psychological evidence or rather follow common sense or other sources?
Well, I actually think in practice, they have just based evidence on kind of common sense in that, so for instance, like a lot of the advice, if you look through the SAGE documents or the SAGE subcommittee, the SPIB, the behavioral science, you know, subcommittee documents, on, you know, behavioral science advice for the pandemic, very little of it is based on actual studies, actual research, and certainly the studies are not, you know, directly relevant to the question. Some of them are kind of, you know, drawing an analogy or whatever. I think people who are smart and interested in psychology can give good advice as long as they make it clear that that's what it is, right? As long as they make it clear that I'm just a psychology professor at Oxford University or whatever, and I have studied behavior for a long time, and I'm not saying that this is based on research, but I'm saying that my impression is X, Y, Z. I think that's a super important bit of input, as long as it's clear that that's what it is, and that can be very helpful and very useful, and in fact, in some ways, less misleading than research, where it's got this aura of being, you know, definitely true. The science says this. The science says this. But actually, we all know that a scientific paper can be extremely flawed in all sorts of ways. So yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to just give common sense advice to policymakers. And again, one of the problems is that having all these kind of scientific committees and saying that, oh, you're a behavioral scientist and so on, you must be basing your opinion on science. Many of them aren't, but I think that's fine, as long as they're clear about it. So it goes back to this question, you know, that the first question I asked. A lot of it is just about calling stuff what it is. Is this your evidence-based advice, or is it just your kind of speculation? And if we're all a bit more honest about that, then I think there would be much less confusion. And you mentioned, Sam, the thing about masks, kids and masks. There was the government announcement yesterday or the day before from Public Health England saying that, you know, their advice that they've been given was that students, the pupils in primary schools should not wear masks because it will interfere with their communication development. Is there any evidence for that? I suspect not. Is there any argument for that? Maybe, but we never saw it. It was never provided for us. We never, you know, we were never given any pointers to a paper or a piece of advice or so on. We were just told that that was what people had said, and I think it just leads to confusion. I think it just builds up questions that no one ever answers. I also think, just one more opinion, is I also think that the quality of the evidence, again, it goes to this question of quality of the evidence and assessing the quality of the evidence in the documents that SAGE provide is often never assessed as well. There are these bullet point lists of studies. A study shows this, a study shows this, a study shows this, but no one ever says, we would give this study an evidence readiness level 4, or we would give this study, we're pretty uncertain about this study, or we're very certain about this study. It's very rare to see that kind of stuff discussed. You see lists of references in SAGE documents, and the first one's like, a huge study from China shows this, and then the second one says, a tiny study from some other country says this, p equals 0.049, and we're going to just have them in the same list, and no one really, is saying, well, actually, that second one's probably less reliable. So I think there are ways of, one of them is the evidence readiness level, but there are ways of, like, putting a kind of I don't know what I want to call it, like an overlay over the evidence to point people towards the stuff that we really think is reliable and the stuff that we think is more uncertain. And my prediction is that we have a lot less of the really reliable stuff than we would like to think.
Wonderful. I think you've answered this other question, which was on misinformation, and I want to try and get a variety of questions, but just to make, for fairness and make sure that people's questions get answered.
Sure.
The question is on the point of misinformation being spread by the mainstream media regarding mask wearing. Was it really misinformation, or was it that the evidence wasn't clear and subsequent studies have found that masks do help?
Well, I mean, we still only have one randomized controlled trial of masks. It was the Denmark study, and actually the conclusion in that study was that there was no effect of masks. Now, I think that was extremely flawed. It was underpowered. It could only detect whether masks cut infection rates by 50%, which is a really unrealistic number. So I think that study had all sorts of problems, and I do think the evidence, and from a theoretical perspective and from some studies of natural experiments and so on, points towards masks working. But I'm not like super 100% certain on that, and it's not like I can point to loads of randomized controlled trials. And normally that's what makes people change their mind. I don't think the media changed their mind. The health authorities changed their mind because of new evidence coming in. I think they looked back and said, actually, our evidence, we were just kind of making this up back in in February, March 2020. We didn't actually have any evidence to say they didn't work. And I think one thing that points towards that is that it's not just that they said that there was no evidence that they work. It's that they said they definitely don't work, and in fact, if you wear a mask, it will make you have a higher risk of getting COVID. That was mentioned in many of the documents, including the World Health Organization. They certainly didn't have any evidence for that. So it's not like they were being rigorously evidence-based all the way through. Some people think they were lying deliberately to make sure that stocks of masks didn't go down too much because healthcare workers needed them. I don't believe that either. I don't think they were lying deliberately. I think they had just I think they just genuinely believed masks didn't work. And once authorities started saying it, conformity did the rest of the work. People came along and said, well, the WHO says this, so I better get on board with that as well, because if I say something different, then I'll be different from the rest of the crowd, and that'll be bad. And I think that's a major dynamic that's kind of underrated.
Wonderful. Okay, next one from Wolfgang Lucas. He asks, how do you think about making a coordinated and collaborative effort to apply the ERL ladder to past research in various domains? What might be the potential benefits, challenges, pitfalls?
I think that's a great idea, and I would love to look into this in more detail, especially when like refining the evidence readiness levels ladder as well, and just working out what the best way of thinking about this is, and doing more case studies of where these interventions or whatever have actually really been applied to real life situations and real life crises and so on. Again, probably quite rare, but I'm sure it does happen. There are many applications of psychology research in the real world, of course, and it does happen. So it would be interesting to see if it's been applied prematurely or whatever. Yeah, I think that could really steer us towards the kinds of studies that we would need to do to be clearer on which research was applicable to the pandemic and which wasn't. So I'm very pro doing that, and I think if I can find some time, I will consider doing that in future.
Great. Next one. How do you think we should prepare for a crisis that hasn't happened yet, i.e. where we won't have an opportunity to test out interventions and hypotheses until it happens, e.g. a cyber attack turning off the nation's power supply? It seems to me that with the coronavirus, the best way to respond is to look what Japan is doing, right? They seem to know what to do.
Well, certainly a lot of the advice on things like ventilation and so on, Japan had it absolutely spot on from early March 2020. They were right. They were talking about the 3 C's, you know, close contact, crowds, and closed spaces, all of which we are now realizing is like, or you know, we realized quite some time ago, even though the government took a while to catch up, are the ways to stop getting the disease. Right? It's not really necessarily about washing your hands. We're all obsessed with washing your hands, but that's not actually a major way, as far as we can see from the studies, that COVID spreads through fomite transmission, so through touching things. Yeah, I think looking at other countries where this has successfully happened, you know, they successfully dealt with this. I mean, not just Japan, but other countries that dealt with SARS-1, for instance. So looking at Taiwan, for instance, looking at Hong Kong and other places like that. The problem that the questioner asks about, though, is like something like a cyber attack, where we just don't really know what that would be like. I guess you could try and extrapolate from situations that were relatively similar, like where natural disasters have caused power outages and so on, and to see what happens there. But I think your response there, Sam, is probably the correct one, in that we did a lot. We didn't do a lot of like looking at other countries before we decided on our measures. Like, we decided on our hand washing thing. That would be our number one thing. You know, you had Boris Johnson talking about it constantly, washing your hands. It's still everywhere, hand washing. You know, you got to get your sanitizer and so on. We decided on that without looking at, you know, say Japan and saying, well, what are they focusing on? And they've got some experience of a respiratory disease spreading through the population and so on.
Great, so we're at 56, so we've probably got time for just maybe 2 questions.
Sure.
I'm fearful that this one by Hannah might be repetition of before. So the pandemic is a good example of psychologist research behaviour in terms of jumping on the hype train. I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on how this could be prevented and whether it should be.
In terms of hype being, yeah, well, I think a big part of clamping down on hype is it sounds a bit unpleasant to say it, but I think shame, right? We want to shame people who hype up their research beyond where the data can go, and not shame them in a kind of unpleasant sense, but criticize that when that appears. Press releases that go out without, you know, that go beyond what the data can show. Books that are written hyping up some problem that we, you know, don't necessarily have, or goes way beyond, you know, the actual level of that problem. I think we need to be critical of that, rather than just sort of accepting that, oh well, you know, when people are talking to the public, they want to simplify things, they want to make things a bit clearer and all that, and that shouldn't be acceptable. There are ways of making this stuff clear and remaining, you know, rigorous with regard to the evidence.
Great. Okay, a couple of minutes left. There's one question here that's signposting you to something that happened in Germany. So the German government, was it researchers advising the German government to induce fear about COVID-19 to ensure compliance to their policy? Can you comment on ethical consequences of advice based on research?
So sorry, say that question again. So
it says, did you see the news about researchers advising the German government to induce fear about COVID-19 to ensure compliance to their policy?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that sounds quite scary. But there could be a much less scary way to phrase that, which is, there's evidence in the psychological literature that fear appeals are useful. Like, you know, those on the back of cigarette packets, they have pictures of like a cancerous lung and all that. There is some evidence, as far as I can see from meta-analyses. Again, I've never looked into the quality of this, and you know what I generally think of the quality of lots of previous psychology research, but there is some evidence that stuff can be effective in persuading people. And so maybe if these people are saying, you should sometimes use fear appeals in your messaging, then I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, because it does seem to work to some extent. But I would have to see exactly the context that they were talking in. I haven't seen that story.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're nearly at the hour mark. So Stuart has to unfortunately pop off to give another talk. So thank you so much, Stuart, for your time. It's been a really good talk, and it's pretty much, I think, 2 years ago to the day almost that you gave a talk for the Rights Club. So
wow,
we'll try and make it more frequent than that. No offence. So you can pop off. Everybody, please.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Stuart,
and thanks everyone for listening. Cheers.
Feel free to carry the conversation off onto Twitter. I will just final few words. We have a talk tomorrow at Durham Riots Club at 12, and it's on R Markdown. So do tune in for that, and I'll put a link in the Q&A, and it'll be plastered all over our Twitter account as well. And try and use the links that we've provided in the Q&A as well, with the slides to today's talk will be added to the OSF, and we'll have the recording on YouTube and on Twitter or signpost as well. Thank you everybody for coming along. Enjoy the rest of your day, and have a lovely weekend as well.